thank you to everybody from around the world for joining. We really appreciate your time today, and we've got an exciting session planned here for us today. So, Hemanth, Jason, I appreciate you guys and your time for joining this as well. I think it's only fitting that as we wrap up Cybersecurity Awareness Month here, we get the opportunity to talk about cybersecurity and compliance in the age of autonomous vehicles. So with that, Hemanth, I want to quickly flip it to you for an introduction into May Mobility.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Cody. Thank you to Upstream for having me today. I want to introduce myself a little bit later. We can do that after talking about May Mobility, but we are a very interesting company. We are a startup. At May, we are always starting with the why. Now, we want to create more of a cleaner, safer, and even more of an accessible transportation company to help with transportation in congested cities. We were really founded to really address the imbalance that we've seen in urban mobility, and we're using technology to transform the way people move. We want to make transportation less dangerous, making commutes smoother and cities even greener. So we're operating autonomous vehicles across several cities currently, and we are focusing on that real world impact. We are continually learning to shape really the future of mobility, and our goal is to transform urban environments for everyone. This is more about our vehicle as a whole, just from a high level of, we use the Toyota Sienna. So Toyota is one of our investors here at May Mobility. So we use the Toyota Sienna. As you can see, this is kind of from a high level of how our vehicle is architectured. Up to 5 passengers. We do have remote monitoring and tele-assist that is taking place within the vehicle. Again, this is an autonomous vehicle, but we do also offer our services, with ADA compliant wheelchair ramps on the back. So this is more about May from a high holistic overview.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hemanth. It's a great overview, and I think it fits right into the topic of Upstream as well. So a quick background on Upstream for those on the phone. Upstream is the leader in smart mobility data management and cybersecurity. Today, we monitor over 30 million connected vehicles worldwide, provide actionable insights into many of the OEMs and mobility partners that we work with across the globe. So quick at a glance view here. And then we'll jump right into it. Hemanth, I'm going to turn this first slide over to you, sir, to kind of give your opinion and overview on autonomous vehicles today.
Yeah, for sure, Cody. Thank you. I think autonomous technologies, what they are doing right now is that they are really transforming industries. They are combining advances with what we've seen with AI, with IoT, robotics, and even machine learning to really drive the efficiency within this area. I think safety and new capabilities are coming into place too with this whole regime. But I think the digital transformation right now is pretty foundational. I think just from enhancing the urban mobility to really creating really robust interconnected smart cities is really critical. And that kind of leads me on talking more about that data-driven decisions, right? Because in the age of autonomy, we've seen that how important data is. Each autonomous vehicle is going to be generating and processing all this data and all the volume of data in real time. And this is going to really allow with those predictive analytics, route optimization, and that quick response to even potential hazards that might come in place. And this is why security here, it's necessary. It's not an afterthought. It's not something we can think afterwards, right? Because with every digital transformation that we're putting into here, there comes with the thought of an expansion on the attack surface. We want to secure each endpoint. We want to secure each point of connectivity from the sensors to the cloud systems. And from the diagram that I showed before, it becomes really essential. And so this can be a compromise at any point, but taking action right now, it's going to really impact that, entire network. And I think, Cody, we can talk about this more further, but kind of like the current state and, where things are when it comes down to the hype cycle position for autonomous vehicles and, our devices.
Yeah, I think in terms of the current state aspect of it, Hemanth, I think it's a really interesting point that you make, especially around kind of the introduction of additional devices and cloud backends to the vehicle, right? It's not just protecting the vehicle itself anymore. It's protecting the vehicle itself plus all of the additional connected devices and different connected aspects of the actual autonomous vehicle system. So when you look at it from a challenge or a conundrum perspective, There's a lot that needs to go into it, whether that is from a regulatory framework side or a complete safety and security aspect, which actually I think is a perfect segue into kind of a conversation briefly around the idea of mobility cyber attacks being on the rise, but also what we're doing as a nation, as a world, et cetera, to help prevent that in the terms of regulation. So recently, we've seen the Biden administration focus on autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles, the importance of setting up the infrastructure, as well as the support for large metro areas, but also suburban areas. And I know Hemanth, May Mobility is doing a lot within the metro areas, but also suburban areas. I'd be really interested in Jason as well to get your opinions and your kind of viewpoints on the compliance side and the regulations.
Yeah, and Hemanth, I'm glad that was a great intro there on kind of your focus on innovation, because that's a lot of what I hear back as well from autonomous companies, from EV companies, because we certainly have overseas no lack of regulation, and those have kind of been used as a guideline here as well. R155, ISO 21434. We've got SOC 2 and ISO 27001. I'm curious your thoughts, because these, from our perspective at Upstream, they definitely drive a need for CSMS, a need for security operations, and we've kind of been out there saying, throwing around this term vSOC, or vehicle security operations, or security operations when it comes to mobility, and that concept of that being a little bit different. I'm curious your thoughts, because I do see kind of these motions that on the one hand are very deliberate in addressing regulation, and then also like we want to innovate, but we want to protect as we do. So very interesting kind of, and in other areas we see this as well, right? Where innovation, regulation is a very, let's meet a baseline, but usually is hinting towards and pointing towards the need for, this is a new space. We've got to protect it a little different than other things.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I appreciate that, Jason. I think the regulation part of it really applies to the entirety of a company, right? This is not just even at May Mobility, but at other AV companies and just the cybersecurity landscape, because the more certifications and the more compliant you are with the industry, the more business that you're going to get, right? You talk about the CSMS, right? Recently, right here is that we have R155, we have ISO 21434, right? Those two standards, are specifically targeting cybersecurity for road vehicles, and that's really setting that foundational requirement for cybersecurity management systems, because you are trying to ensure that vehicles are secured throughout their entire life cycle, not just at one port or one point in time, but their entire life cycle. We've seen with R155 that is requiring a lot of those regular risk assessments, a lot of that monitoring, incident response capabilities, for all on-road vehicles. But on the other hand, we've seen ISO 21434. That's really outlining the best practices for assessing and managing cybersecurity risks, within the vehicle components. And I think, this is where a CSMS would come into place, and even a vSOC, right? And I think Upstream would be one example of where that comes into place with implementing those steps and ensuring that companies are focused and aligned when it comes down to that regulatory landscape.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jason.
No, I think, so when you think about that, obviously we got a lot of good things going on, and it's very interesting because some of us have been in cyber in other aspects of the rest of the company, and you see kind of this coming in and regulating the things that are different about, like we have a product that the whole life cycle needs to be managed. I'm glad you're pointing that out. When you think about the risks and how that's changed and different, I think one of the interesting things that I like to think about, and I really like your perspective on this, Hemanth, is what are the things that keep you up at night, or keep you, that you actually worry about in this domain that is very different than, I'd say, securing a laptop, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think real quick, coming back to the points that we discussed, even though ISO 21434 and we've seen with R155, that's more relevant with the cybersecurity when it comes down to automotive. But believe it or not, in enterprise security, we've seen SOC 2, we've seen ISO 27001, but believe it or not, that actually applies also over to the landscape of autonomous vehicles and just the landscape of automotive, right? Because organizational data security is more important, and especially broadly from a standpoint of focusing on controls that are related to data processing integrity, confidentiality, and even privacy. And this is all going to be crucial for handling the sensitive data that's really involved in autonomous vehicle operations. ISO 27001 offers more of a comprehensive framework, for managing the information security encompassing with, data protection, risk management, and just compliance. And that's going to be more of an overall space for AVs and just IoT. With that being said, though, to answer more specifically, Jason, your question, what keeps me up at night, as a cybersecurity and compliance engineer, it's going to really be the attack surface, right? We've seen a lot of threat actors. We've seen Black Basta. We've seen ransomware groups targeting just the IoT space. There is a risk of them just targeting other sectors too. It can be AVs, it can be connected vehicles. We've seen what happened in connected vehicles. We've seen big three automotive companies been breached, on the side of the road with the vehicle stopped with their hazard lights on. But with autonomy, there are, number of potential attack points, and that grows from endpoint to another. Each sensor, each camera, the communication link, a lot of that's going to be presenting a possible entry for malicious actors. And so that's why there has to be more of an increasing need for that, comprehensive security strategy at a company, not even at May, but at any company that's really focusing on, self-driving companies that are focusing on autonomy. We've seen another big standpoint of zero-day vulnerabilities and threat detection, and I know your report recently that addressed that is that autonomous systems and really that IoT device, those are constantly integrating new firmware and software, and a lot of these can really contain the unknown vulnerabilities. And so that's why we really need that rapid threat detection response to potential zero-day exploits, and that's a priority, and that's where vSOCs come into place.
Yeah, it's interesting just in your response there, Hemanth. I'm hearing, IoT, this idea of security in general is a little bit different. We've got plenty of protocols, backend APIs, fleet APIs to protect against. We have some things going on with PII and personal identifiable information. That even a nuanced concept that comes up there with EVs, where we have some kind of a link between the charging station and the vehicle we're driving, right? So it's very interesting to look at this. You brought up cameras, and I guess that's what makes me think about a PII as well. Is a lot of times we're thinking about just a number or something that identifies us, but what about the whole video stream of everywhere we drove during the day, right? It's just a very, very different, very escalated landscape.
No, for sure.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Hemanth.
No, I was also going to mention, and I think part of the protection process is going to be doing that penetration testing, right? And that's really going to be essential to identify, protocol vulnerabilities, in the communication protocols. We're talking about MQTT, we have Bluetooth, we have Zigbee. These are often vulnerable to really interception or even spoofing. And you're talking about EV charging units, and we've seen recently where people are printing malicious QR links or QR codes, pasting them on the EV charging station, and soon enough they're paying some group instead of actually charging their vehicle, right, at the end of the day. And with fleet APIs, these are really important, and this is something Upstream you guys focus on primarily is fleet APIs, how to manage that critical vehicle to infrastructure and vehicle to vehicle communications, right? We want to enable the coordination and even the operational control. I think just as an industry, hijacking or even spoofing APIs could really allow those attackers to manipulate the vehicle behavior, gain unauthorized access, or even intercept commands. I think a great example, in this area would be looking at a spoofed GPS signal and how that could really mislead a vehicle into basically following incorrect routes and compromising safety of the passengers. I think that from a best practice, it's really API hardening, doing that regular testing of the fleet APIs, to find those vulnerabilities, and that's going to be really crucial in this process.
All the stuff that you hit on, Hemanth, is it's really intriguing and very top of mind, especially around the kind of QR phishing. There was a topic last week that was discussed during a conference that I believe the terminology they're using now is called quishing, which is kind of funny when you think about it, but it's very true. How many times have you been asked to scan a QR code on your phone? And to your point, Hemanth, you might be paying bad actors or threat actors versus the actual company that you're supposed to be paying. And it's only going to become more chaotic, especially in the topic of PII. So some very interesting points there that I think really kind of hit home on this, the kind of key cyber threats that we face today.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those threats, are facing privacy, PII and even consumer data privacy, right? And this is why we have all of these regulations, in California and just overall landscape of SOC 2, ISO 27001 is how are we going to keep our passengers safe with their data? I think an individual that is operating their vehicle using an app, right? There are so many risks that are kind of can be identified, later on in the processes, but how can we identify those risks right now? You can turn on your car now with the touch of a button from your phone. You can move it now. You can make it park, right? And just all that assistantship that's taking place in the app is, a bad actor could take in control of that. I do want to talk about PII for a sec here. And I think this is really important when it comes down to autonomous vehicles. For example, you have data anonymization and, you have to really comply with the best regulations that are taking place here. How are you going to anonymize the data of passengers that are requesting rides, right? You can do the first initial, your first name, first initial of your last name. That's securing PII. What if there's companies out there that are, implementing ways for passengers at hospitals to be picking up, right? I think a lot of that comes into place, especially for companies that are using, in-car cameras. A lot of this is going to be adding a layer of risk. But, how are we going to protect and have those right controls to protect that risk really comes down to it. Overall, while all these kind of, enhance safety and, gather kind of analytics, they kind of created privacy concerns, especially if data storage, access, and, deletion protocols are not really strictly followed. And I think this is where, as an autonomous vehicle company, that's something we're doing a great job of, is making sure that, our passengers are safe and our data is secured.
Completely. And I think it actually, those statements, Hemanth, is a great segue into this topic about the complexity of both the cyber risks and the attack methods that we're talking about within, again, traditional vehicles, but also autonomous vehicles. When you add, and you spoke about it earlier, you add this kind of 3 different layers. They may not necessarily be traditional, right? You've got the IoT device layer, the IoT cloud layer, and then that API layer. Really introduces a very kind of complex attack method here. I'd love to both get yours and Jason's thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think Jason, I think I've done enough talking for a while.
Yeah.
Hand over the mic to
Yeah,
you.
I mean, you've seen Cody and kind of Upstream's approach into this. We like to focus on these layers because I think one way you can look at it is you take an application, and essentially that's what we're talking about, is a fairly complicated application. At the end of the day, to the end user, it's just one experience, right? And you spread that out over these layers and you have this very complex interaction. I think that's where we see different themes from industry kind of pointing out, hey, when you take and you do this, the surface area is just that much more exposed. So you have, essentially, you could look at things like the API OWASP top 10. And one thing I like to do is kind of go through those with customers, and you can almost sum those all up as, or the majority of them up as, application logic errors that happen when we spread that logic out between these different layers, and now we have communications in between. And what if it's a bad actor and not your application communicating, say, from the application layer up to the API layer, right? And the situations that introduces. I just think there's a lot there to consider. Even, I mean, it's kind of a silly example, but even thinking back to the example of the QR code, right? We're just thinking about how to make things easier. Like, it's faster than typing, right? Just point, click, there we go. But now you've added this layer of obscurity where that little sticker that somebody introduces becomes a pretty powerful thing, right? So I think we have that really across the entire landscape here when we step back and look at it. And it's an interesting, because we do want to keep innovating, we do want to keep pushing, right? But it makes it even more important to double down in the due diligence.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I
no,
actually
for
think
sure.
that's a very important topic too, is to highlight that idea of as we add more to the process, we need to have more due diligence that's done on the back end, right, to ensure the safety and security of these applications or these specific layers that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think as you mentioned, Jason, you talked about the OWASP, top 10. A lot of that focuses on the OWASP top 10, like API, and how
Yeah.
can you prevent those API exploits, right? I think overall, we're seeing a lot of those backend APIs really facilitate communication between the vehicle, and the cloud-based systems. And so, from best practices, it's really important to really enforce, a lot of that strong authentication, practicing of rate limiting. We talk about encryption, and all the data that's being exchanged, and helps us to really secure the APIs from unauthorized access or even data leaks. And I think this is where, kind of moving into the IoT space, we are using protocols, and as an organization or just overall throughout the industry, a lot of companies are using MQTT, we're using HTTP, HTTPS protocols, right? And really handling that data exchange between components within the autonomous systems. And so a lot of these protocols can really be vulnerable, right, to interception or spoofing attacks. And this is really why, again, I'm going to say this for the third time, why vSOC is important, right? Because we want to especially communicate, throughout our system is, we have a CrowdStrike or we have a SentinelOne for our IT systems, but what about our vehicles, right? Where's the SOC that's taking place there? And this is where a tool like this would come into place. But, that being said, I know we talked about from the back end, like, what we could do from a compliance standpoint. I think this is where Tara would come in, right? That threat analysis and risk assessment for, prototypes, especially when you are putting stuff inside a vehicle at any company, building, it's like building a Lego set, but making sure it moves and takes people from point A to point B is, those places where we can find those risks at the beginning and not at the end.
Yep. And I think, Hemanth, to that point, we've spoken pretty heavily in the past couple of slides about the idea of processes, tools, and orchestration being an extremely important part of the process in securing everything from an AV to an EV to SDVs, as we've got on the screen here, right? When you look at the kind of process of dynamic Tara, can you dig a little bit deeper into some of the potential requirements and tools and orchestrations that go into that?
Yeah, for sure. Wow, there's a lot I can say right now about this because it is an important process from a product and IoT standpoint. But I think before autonomous prototypes, really reach to the production stage, doing those Tara processes are really crucial, right? A lot of this is going to be involving analyzing potential threats to each sensor or even component and really identifying those vulnerabilities specific to the prototype designs. And so through Tara, you can really find those weaknesses, ensure that they don't escalate into any more significant risks when scaled for production. That being said, though, I think Tara also addresses, and I guess this is best practice, is really looking at that component level, doing a security assessment from the component level. Each vehicle sensor, whether if it's LiDAR or radar, GPS, a lot of it's going to be requiring the assessment to really determine vulnerabilities and secure potential points of exploitation. And so these assessments kind of include, evaluating the firmware, doing the testing, signal encryption, and really examining physical security to protect the sensor's integrity. And it might feel like more of a penetration test, but again, I think combining both together would even be much of a robust way to provide the expertise of security. And lastly, I think from like a 3-tier standpoint, I think the last thing I'd want to talk about here is, kind of the pre-production risk mitigation, right? Doing risk assessments kind of at every stage of development will really allow you to establish and find those preventive measures early on and really minimize security gaps that could really be hard to address once the vehicle is in production. Because, by securing a lot of those prototypes before, the production version can really benefit from more of a security posture at the end of the day. Because the last thing that you want is, somebody to bring a Flipper Zero in and start playing around with your devices and turn things off. And at the end of the day, the vehicle is going to stop.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting as you were kind of highlighting a lot of the stuff that, especially from an autonomous vehicle perspective, you see it on this slide in this double infinity, and I think it really shows the importance of, again, that idea of verification, validation, and then operation, with the operation coming after the TARA. But the amount of processes that goes into the actual verification and validation before you can have that continuous operation there on the right is pretty heavy lift, if you ask me.
Absolutely. I definitely agree. And I think the TARA is just, it's part of the GRC process, right? Within the cybersecurity engineering, sector, is that it's really going to be helping with validation, and it's going to be playing a big role at the end of the day to ensuring safety and really continuing that digital future of security.
Yeah. It's great that we hit on this. Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, the big thing I always take from this is you look at the feedback loops, right, and the continuous kind of flow of those, and it's a theme of sort of how cybersecurity has been evolving in general, is to make sure that those are tightly coupled, and that we continue to get that back into the process, and that it's considered in moving forward. Some of the surface areas we mentioned and things are very, very minor components, or very, very minor pieces. It'd be very easy to take those in as a component, and we don't even think about the overall surface area that we expose there. Think about like infotainment units, right? And things that are just auxiliary. People want to listen to the radio while they're going for a car ride, and they become actually significant surface areas. It's important to understand those things, and that we have feedback loops on those as well, right? And throughout this whole process.
Yeah, it's the whole aspect of the vehicle these days is it's important that we've got security and testing and everything in between, right? So it's good to see that. One of the things that I want to take a step back on that we've hit a bunch in the conversation so far today is the idea of around the kind of the data conundrum, right? Traditional vehicles are becoming more connected. I get in my car every day and it says, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, Cody. I've got my application that follows it. Hemanth, as you mentioned, I can stop and start my vehicle from my phone. When you get to this idea of introducing different data sources, especially from an autonomous vehicle perspective that may be different from a traditional OEM, Hemanth, I'd love to kind of get your idea of securing the pipeline and some of the aspects that go into this data conundrum.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the diagram that you're showing right now, especially from a security architecture standpoint, it doesn't really, it's not supposed to just cover the vehicle, but also the entire ecosystem. And that's something that it's doing here. I think the things that really have to be secured during the pipeline, right? The backend systems, the communication protocols, the vehicle sensors, and even the data storage environments. Because I think the backend systems, or just the pipeline, is going to be that cloud that's taking place, right? Are we doing that static code analysis before production? Are we ensuring that all vulnerabilities are secured before pushing that out to production? And a lot of this is going to be really requiring on an approach that really views all elements as interconnected, with one weak link potentially compromising the entire system. And I think this is why a lot of companies should be taking that multi-layered protection, right? That multiple security layers. We talk about data encryption, access controls, network segmentation, right? That's going to be all critical when it comes down to securing that pipeline. A lot of these layers are going to be providing that redundancy. So if one layer fails, and others can kind of mitigate the risk. And so that's going to enhance the overall resilience of the pipeline in this, what you see in this diagram.
Yep. Yeah. And it's actually funny, Jason, you started to hit on it in the previous slide, but the idea of the onboard systems and the kind of necessity that comes along with that when it comes to HBOM, SBOM, XBOM. Can you just kind of chime in on that aspect of it?
It's interesting. I see it because I see similar things going on there. We just talked about the layers and how we spread out this application across them. A lot of times what happens is you end up with different languages in play. You end up with, slightly just very nuanced differences in data types and things like that. And I think one of the ways that, we at Upstream have approached this is really understanding the data model. What is the actual data that's in play and the importance of that? And if you understand that through the whole process, through the whole overall application, you have this better understanding. And I think to some degree, that that idea that you're going back to, Cody, on understanding the H-bomb, S-bomb, X-bomb is a very similar endeavor, right? It's to understand that these things are all, relative pieces of the whole, and to understand them in context. So that's, this idea that, like, and I think we've seen a lot on S-bombs and H-bombs, and Hemanth, I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well. But there's absolutely been a lot more awareness driving, just we need to understand everything that makes up these components, everything that's involved there. Because even though it's just the Bluetooth so that we can listen to, enjoy the music, it could have a very big impact on the overall security. It is involved in the overall component, and you have to think about how these things are linked.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's great you brought up the whole the stance of SBOM and where that comes into place, because people know SBOMs, from the infrastructure IT side, but where does it come and fit, in the autonomous vehicle side? And I think overall, SBOMs are really going to be enhancing the visibility and traceability, right? Because every SBOM, that's going to list each software component and its origin, and that's going to give AV cybersecurity teams more visibility into all the dependencies, all the open source libraries, the third-party modules, right? And a lot of this visibility is critical, really, for understanding where vulnerabilities might exist within the AV software ecosystem. And so it's going to make my job easier, to assess and secure each component. I think too, with SBOMs, we've seen more of a rapid vulnerability management cycle, because like when new vulnerabilities like zero-day threats are discovered in a lot of used software components, I think the SBOM would really play a role in enabling a lot of AV companies to quickly locate and address the affected parts of the code base. For autonomous vehicles, this response is pretty critical, especially for maintaining the safety and focusing on the compliance with cybersecurity standards like ISO 21434, and I'll talk about this a little further as UL 4600. Actually, let me talk about it right now since I got to that. But I think UL 4600 plays a big role. This is a standard that is focusing on cybersecurity and other components in specifically autonomous vehicles. A little similar to ISO 21434, but UL 4600 again is more autonomous vehicle specific. And I think SBOMs also play a role in supply chain security, and I can go down a big hole on that if you want, but I'll pass it on to Jason or Cody if you want to talk about something else more specific to SBOMs.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll save the SBOM aspect of it for a deep dive on a follow-up webinar if we think it might be fit. I'm getting some cues here that maybe we need to do a second follow-up to this.
Absolutely.
It was interesting. I will mention just before we move on from the topic there that just because this happened at a recent conference, I had somebody come up and say, we're not really that worried about SBOMs because we use mostly commercial components in tooling that we're using. And it was interesting because I had to point out a few examples, and this is really about Hemanth, you put it best, of understanding really the common, everything that makes up the component, because those could be, they're not just open source, right? I think we've had some very big open source examples that are top of mind for everyone, but there's been some very big closed source and commercial examples there too. So, but yeah, definitely sounds like a topic we all have a lot to say on for a deeper dive.
And it's a hot topic in the industry these days. Jason, you and I were at Auto ISAC last week, and I think there was at least 2 or 3 different sessions that were solely focused on it. So maybe we add to those 2 or 3 different sessions and make a 4th one for the folks here on the phone eventually.
Absolutely. No, for sure. I do want to talk about something, though, when it comes down to those SBOMs and where we can kind of apply that, in the AV sector, right? I think we have that automated scanning and alert system that's really being utilized, but I think using SBOMs, a lot of these tools can scan for vulnerabilities and alert teams in the real time. And we talk about, securing the development integration. I think this is where SBOMs enables that secure development practices. They're going to be verifying each software component against various trusted sources, and reducing the risk of introducing malicious code. And I think we'll talk about OTA updates at some point, but Aspom helps with that too, right? They're helping in ensuring that they only secure, the verified components and that are being introduced into the vehicle.
Yep, it's funny that you bring up the topic of OTAs, because I think we'd kind of mentioned on this slide we wanted to briefly touch base on the idea of kind of fleet APIs and kind of a high level idea of what May is doing from an API perspective, both on the public documentation of fleet APIs, but also why it's important to secure those APIs, Hemanth, and even getting into that portion from the API perspective of OTAs, both today and in the future, especially from an autonomous vehicle perspective, because the way that data comes off of the vehicles is a little bit different in AVs than in a traditional EV or SDV.
Yeah, no, that's great that you mentioned the public documentation. So anybody that's listening right now, you can actually go on Google and search up public documentation for Fleet API May Mobility, and we actually have our public documentation available. A lot of other companies, in the AV sector do that. They publish their public documentation when looking at API security and just their Fleet API. But from a high level, May Mobility's Fleet API really is going to be enabling the communication, right? We've seen that between the vehicle and the central systems, supporting that fleet management, the diagnostics and the navigation. And so, we've seen the public documentation that we published, that kind of provides the transparency, but also, talks about the rigorous security to protect against unauthorized access, looking at hijacking and even, data manipulation. But I think, Fleet API here also is relevant in just the cloud environment and where, a lot of that is going to be taking place. And the lines between those two areas. We talk about like the authentication and authorization too is, using, secure tokens to really find that role-based access control to, I think, further restrict API access to authorized entities. I think best practice is why encryption, right? Encrypting all those API communications to really prevent any interception, especially for the sensitive vehicle data. And I think of overall best practices and a lot of research that's shown that API rate limiting and even the logging, right, that takes place. I think best practices and a lot of research has been done around this is implementing that rate limiting technique to really prevent denial of service attacks and maintaining that detailed logs for anomaly detection.
Yeah, it's extremely important, and I can imagine that a lot of the folks that are on the phone are trying to understand a little bit why of the kind of the heavy focus, right, on APIs, which kind of leads to a topic that is top of mind, especially in the industry over the last few weeks, is the ability to hack them and the potential to control the vehicles on a worldwide scale. We saw this recently when it came to Sam Curry and the ability to create significant vulnerabilities in APIs to remotely hijack vehicles. I'd love both. Maybe we'll start, Jason, on your thoughts and then go over to Hemanth after that.
Yeah, I think this is in keeping with that theme of things being more spread out. And Hemanth, I have to say kudos to May and your documentation, which I would encourage people to go out and look at, because you might look at this and depending on what company you work for, depending on the perspective of those around, you might look at that and go, wow, this is like, you would publish something like this, like put it on the public internet. And I think that's been one of the fallacies, actually, as we've moved into the space, is everybody goes, I've actually talked to legitimate customers that say, what API when something like this comes out and it's being exploited, because when it's a back-end API or when it's something that you just don't expect is for public consumption, I think there is a little bit, and I don't want to speak authoritatively on this because maybe we don't have consensus across the industry, right? Maybe I have an opinion, and you guys can, Hemanth, I'd like to hear you, kind of speak to both sides of that as well. But essentially, when you put an app out there that consumes an API, you have put that API out for public consumption, right? And you have to be aware of that. You have to understand that others are going to discover that and perhaps try to use it without your app. So we have to put the right controls in the right place, right? So that's kind of what I see happening here. It's I think that Sam's found an area where he's just got lots of pay dirt here to explore.
Yeah, no, for sure. And hopefully if Sam Curry is on this webinar listening right now, thank you for joining. But most importantly, his research has really delved into the area of, what as security companies and AV companies and automotive, what can we do to protect our API and to prevent those API vulnerabilities? We've seen where APIs are being really installed in that cloud environment, and this is something that we talked about recently here is, how are we going to tokenize and how are we going to anonymize APIs? I think Access IAM comes into a big factor too, is, those best practices in IAM within your cloud environment to really containerize and access APIs for specific individuals or, different parties. But I think from Sam Curry's standpoint, a lot of those recent vulnerabilities really highlight how weak API configurations or even improper authentication can really expose critical backend systems. And this is why, as the GRC guy, those regular API audits are going to be crucial, doing that penetration testing, and even monitoring that API, using a vSOC or whatever tool it is, to really to find those crucial vulnerabilities and to avoid any exploits.
I can only imagine, Hemanth, as these kind of things hit the public every morning or every other morning, you wake up, you check your phone, and you probably have to add it to your list of things on your to-dos for the day, right? It's just another thing that keeps you up at night.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think it's not just cybersecurity compliance, but security engineering is my role in ensuring that our company is protected and making sure that we are on the landscape and in the industry looking at what attack vectors are open, because one attacker could not just target AVs, they could target the automotive industry, right? Because it is a big umbrella of open opportunity for a lot of those threat actors. We've seen black box stuff, we've seen ransomware groups really attack one, jump to another, and kind of deep dive into that area.
Yeah, especially when you look at the concept of, traditional OEMs are now partnering with companies like May Mobility for their AV needs. So it really adds in an additional layer that you have to protect, right? And I think it's very important, and it's cool to see that May Mobility is kind of at the front of that, the forefront of that. So I like that. As we wrap up here, we've got a handful of key takeaways I think that we hit pretty hard during this presentation. The first one being that risk is dynamic. There's not just one attack vector. There's not one area of risk. It continues to evolve and it continues to move forward as technology evolves. It moves forward. The key point, the second one, is that autonomous drive systems do require purpose-built detection and security. And I think as you look at the security side of this, that kind of ties in the third point there of building a vSOC and having the ability to have a cybersecurity platform that is consistently monitoring, detecting, and responding to all sorts of elements from an AV perspective, from an API perspective, and from a traditional vehicle perspective. Hemanth, Jason, any thoughts on the key takeaways?
Yeah, I think, I do want to talk about kind of your current state and future state. I think those will kind of be my wrapping up thoughts here. And I think in today's AV systems, these are more in an advanced stage of just pilot testing, right? We're looking at with a strong emphasis on safety. We're looking at regulatory compliance and incremental improvements in technology. And I think the industry is moving through regulatory and technological situations, but they're also gaining the public trust. But from a future state standpoint, I think AVs are really envisioning, the seamless integration into urban and rural infrastructures and suburban areas. And this is where, cybersecurity really comes into place, especially with those highly resilient systems. And so I think the future, will really bring self-sustaining fleets with minimal human intervention. I think advancing OTA capabilities and, real-time data integrations are going to be important, and this is going to really improve the service quality. And again, this is going to be all evolved around this factor of cybersecurity and ensuring that our vehicles are safe.
Awesome. It's amazing intel from your side, Hemanth. Thank you. we have two questions, I think, that we wanted to hit from a Q&A perspective. I'm going to turn it over to Jason for the first question. Jason, it looks like the question is, as autonomous vehicles become more connected to digital systems, what steps are being taken to protect from cyber terrorism threats? And how can we prevent attacks that could target connection between vehicles and critical infrastructure?
Okay, yeah. So this is a good one. So so when you think about the largest security concerns, or the scope kind of goes really wide there, right? When I think about this question, I think about us discussing the layers, how they're connected, how they've been spread out, how the surface area has changed. I also think about things like the importance of this continuous feedback loop. And maybe the times, we even got, you hate to say pen tests or point in time, tests, you do need to know where you are. But I think we're evolving to think about those things as more ongoing. These things are happening all the time and feeding back all the time into what we're doing to protect and defend them. Obviously, observability has always been a core of and continues to be a challenge in how we get, you could have a sophisticated tool that could be the most amazing at giving you the most early alert of a detection possible, but if it can't see all the data, if it can't see, if it's not in that point of observability, it's a challenge. So I think, just thinking about actually all of us on the call too, and how we've been challenged to continue to address this, that's one that's top of mind for sure, as we continue to address that observability and trying to bring that together so that we can have that good correlation.
It's a great answer. I appreciate that. The second one here, let me just see what we've got. Hemanth, this is a question for you. How are you managing the different supplier solutions inside of the AV? And on top of that, and it kind of goes back to some of the stuff we talked about, are all of the OTA updates coordinated and managed within the OEM cloud versus your own?
Great question. So I think the first part from the third party, I believe, right? I think it comes down to doing those, believe it or not, those TARA and that risk assessment before. I think integrating that process into the integral area of where to determine those risks is going to be really critical, and this is where it comes into place. Is understanding and doing that TARA before on the third-party components on those IoT devices that are being put inside the vehicle. I think a lot of that is going to be doing a lot of those regression testing on those components, making sure that the vehicle is secured at the end of the day, because everything you plug and play at the end is going to be what you see. And so before, it goes into quote unquote production, I think those devices will have to go through like a TARA assessment, have to go through a risk assessment, and third-party companies overall, as we, do our assessment from a security background. And to address the question about OTAs, over the air, I think as an industry, that is kind of a big practice as OEMs do follow it. No, not talking about May or talking about a specific company, but a lot of companies are kind of going in that area of doing over the air type of updates for vehicles. So I think a lot of OEMs are starting to really focus on it, but it really depends from one company to another on how they want to kind of navigate that route and how they want to telematically, all that data transferring. So
that makes sense. That makes sense, guys. This wraps us up for the session today. We thank everybody on the phone here and on the bridge. If there's any questions for Hemanth, myself, or Jason, please feel free to reach out to us at our emails here. We're all on LinkedIn as well. We'd love to hear from the folks on the bridge here. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Great conversation.